There we go again. See, it just felt like I was taking shells on the bottom. And another nice one. Oh man. All right. Nice fish. Nice speckled trout. Where speckled trout feed during winter is a question that many inshore anglers ask after the cold has set in. And that's usually because the fall fishing spots that produce so well are no longer productive. It's obvious that something changed, but what? In this guide, you and I will take a closer look at the winter fishing pattern and reveal where you need to begin casting a line in order to catch speckled trout right here on Louisiana's coast. And we begin by asking the question, where are speckled trout feeding once it gets cold? Well, the short answer is that speckled trout will leave the highways white shrimp no longer migrate through and begin pursuing demersal finfish near available cover, such as rock piles and oyster reefs. Maybe that leaves you scratching your head, so let's unpack it into a longer, more thoughtful answer that will ultimately serve your winter fishing trips much better. We will get started by recapping the primary forage that speckled trout were chasing before winter kicked in. Primary forage during the fall pattern. During fall, it was pretty easy to locate where speckled trout would feed. That is, of course, if you understood the bigger picture of what trout were feeding on the most, or their primary forage. During the fall, that primary forage is white shrimp. Why are white shrimp the primary forage during fall? Well, because during fall, they are migrating to the Gulf of Mexico and, as a result, become concentrated and vulnerable to hungry speckled trout. It's a long journey since most of them are starting it way inside the marsh, and it begins about the same time that speckled trout are returning from their own spawn in saltier water outside of the marsh. These two forces collide, and what we get is a reliable pattern, producing great fishing that leads to non-stop action and easy limits of speckled trout. But the easy fall pattern doesn't last forever. Eventually, the white shrimp migration will be over, and where speckled trout feed during winter will be different than where they fed during fall. Real quick important note about white shrimp and winter. We anglers have a tendency to think in terms of extremes or black and white, and rarely anything in between. For example, it's known that during summer, speckled trout will migrate outside the marsh to spawn. But this doesn't mean that every single speckled trout is outside the marsh and that it's impossible to catch just one inside. That's an example of thinking in terms of extremes, and it can hurt our ability to see the marsh for what it is. Fact of the matter is this. Even when the run of white shrimp is over, there are still white shrimp inside the marsh. The shrimp that stay inside the marsh tend to be juveniles, or just some poor guy who missed the bus. The difference is that there aren't that many of them, and they're not actively leaving the marsh in large groups traveling along with the tide. For example, I was fishing in Venice during January, when I caught a speckled trout that coughed up a white shrimp. It was pretty deep and the water temperature was 51 degrees. Nor did I see any shrimp popping at the surface like we do during fall. I think that shrimp was just living there on the bottom when it was unlucky enough to be eaten by a speckled trout. Anyway, moving on. When the fall run of white shrimp is over, speckled trout will need to find other food, and that other food doesn't behave the same way as migrating white shrimp. Because of this, where speckled trout feed during winter will be different due to where this food lives. But what kind of food is this? The answer, demersal finfish. Maybe you're wondering, what the hell is a demersal finfish? It's a kind of fish that lives and feeds on or near the bottom of the water. Despite the $10 word used to describe them, you're most likely already familiar with these kinds of bait that speckled trout love to chow on. Croakers, violet gobies, pot-bellied minnows, cockahos, and more. But what about mullet and pogies? They're gone too. They left the marsh for their own spawn. Mullet spawn from October into January, while pogies spawn from October to March. However, just like white shrimp, this doesn't mean the marsh is totally devoid of them. Where are demersal finfish located on Louisiana's coast? These fish are small and easily eaten by speckled trout, so they need cover to hide in. But having protection isn't enough. They also need to have food, and the following locations consistently provide both. My favorite places where speckled trout feed during winter has to be oyster reefs, then rock piles, just because that's where I've caught most of them. But I also like bends and bayous where water is deeper, as well as grass flats, cane stubble, dead-end canals, and shell bars. Where are demersal finfish not located? For the sake of learning, it's important to point out where these fish are definitely not located. A great example would be wide open water with a flat and featureless muddy bottom. If there was ever an example of an underwater desert, that's it. Here's some lagniappe. Now you have a good idea as to where to begin fishing for winter speckled trout. They've left the tidal highways of fall and moved to the rock piles and oyster reefs of winter. If you enjoyed this guide, then please consider watching my video on dead-end canals or the one about the Pac Man pattern, both applicable to winter fishing for speckled trout and redfish. Tight lines, and thanks for watching.